Welcome back to Inside Medical Malpractice. I'm Chris Rokosh, and unbelievably, this is the 5th season and the 70th episode of this podcast. I literally can hardly believe it. And I want to say thanks to all of you who have listened and subscribed and commented and supported. I appreciate it so much, I can't even tell you. We're going to change focus a little bit in the first part of this season. The first few episodes, we're going to take a slightly different focus, shining a light on patient safety initiatives, the communication and response to medical errors when they happen, and how they can or do or are hoped to affect both patient safety outcomes and the volume of medical malpractice litigation. To start us off today in this series, I want to let you know that you're in for a powerful conversation that just might change how you think about patient safety. We have two incredible guests together for the first time, whose stories are both heart-wrenching and inspiring. If you're a regular listener, you will recognize them both from their previous episodes. First up, we have RaDonda Vaught, a former registered nurse from Tennessee. On March 25th, 2022, RaDonda was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide due to fatal medication error, a rare criminal prosecution for an unintentional mistake. RaDonda's previous episode aired in 2 parts in September of 2023, and if you haven't listened to them, you just must. Her story is unlike anything you've ever heard, and her episodes have become some of the most listened to of all time. And I was just saying to her, her episodes on YouTube are by far the most listened to of all time. Our other guest is Leilani Schweitzer. Leilani's 20-month-old son, Gabriel, died after a series of medical errors that occurred over several days in 2 different hospitals, involving multiple healthcare providers, some incredibly sophisticated medical and alarm equipment, which was unintentionally silenced by a nurse. Leilani's episode originally aired in June of 2022, and if you haven't heard it, don't miss it. I mean it. I had known of Leilani for years because I've shown her TEDx talks, transparency, compassion, and truth in medical errors to thousands of nurses at every one of my legal issues and nursing conferences. Leilani's podcast is also one of the most listened to on Inside Medical Malpractice, and I just looked on the TEDx site today, and her talk has over 231,000 views. I'd like to say that there's at least 5,000 more than that, just because I show it once to hundreds and hundreds of people at a time, so she's got a lot. Both RaDonda and Leilani's podcasts are available on multiple platforms where you can watch them, and in video on the Inside Medical Malpractice YouTube site, if that's what you prefer. But please, today, I want to impress upon you and to ask you not to let the significance of these 2 guests coming together get lost on you. On one side, we have a nurse whose mistake led to a patient's death. And on the other side, a mother who lost a child due to medical error by a nurse looking after her son. These unimaginable events could not have only shattered their lives, and in no doubt some ways did, but it also could have turned them into incredible adversaries. Yet here they are, not as enemies, not destroyed, but united in a shared goal of improving patient safety, and to quote Leilani, to keep the bad things from getting worse. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of speaking with these 2 to prepare for the podcast, and let me tell you, I honestly barely had to say a word. Their conversation was immediately so compelling and engaging that I couldn't even write fast enough to keep up with their thoughts. I was so struck by their unique perspectives, their shared goals, and their deep commitment. And here's a couple things I did manage to scribble down when they were talking that stayed with me, and I think we'll probably go in deeper today. There was some talk about the inevitable. I think it's you, Leilani, who said, if we're all more honest about the fact that things will go wrong, we'll be better equipped to handle those situations when they do. And both of you had some version of the dedication it takes to do this work, that people working in patient safety need to be relentlessly dedicated. The progress is slow, but RaDonda pointed out that quick fixes are rarely effective in healthcare, dangerous even sometimes. And they talked about perspective and the crucial difference between those who work in the trenches in healthcare and those people on the outside who are trying to make changes. So stick around as we dive deep into this conversation and we explore how these two individuals, despite their terrible experiences, are doing what they can to make healthcare safer. There's so much to talk about, so let's get started. First off, welcome, both of you. So happy to have you here. Just tell me, first of all, how are you, Leilani? How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm in Reno, Nevada. It's a absolutely beautiful, starting to be autumn day. I'm in my art studio. I found a place in my life where I can do my art and work on patient advocacy in a few different ways, and so I feel very fortunate to be able to pursue both of those things that matter so much to me.
Awesome. And RaDonda, how are you? And what are you up to?
I'm well. We're in the busy season on our farm, and we finally had a little bit of a break in the weather. So, like Leilani said, fall is coming, which is nice. And I'm getting ready to sort of start the fall conference speaking engagements that I have scheduled for the months of September, October, and November. So I'm looking forward to those opportunities to, you know, have more of these conversations with people who are, have the same goals that I do. Let's make things better.
Awesome. And good luck with that. It is a busy conference season in the fall, isn't it? You will be busy. So let's just do a quick recap for people who haven't heard the previous podcast. Although I'm going to tell you, everybody who's listening, go back and listen. It'll be well worth your time. It'll open your mind, it'll open your hearts, and it'll engage a perspective in a way that you just never even thought it could. But give me a brief rundown about your journey into patient safety and advocacy, Leilani.
Well, it's not a place I ever planned to be, which I think many of us who get involved in this work would say. Um, Most of us had other plans for our lives. But 19 years ago, my son Gabriel died after a series of mistakes made at two different hospitals. Initially, he was misdiagnosed in Reno, in the city where I am now. And then I took him to Stanford Children's Hospital, where the severity of his condition was not recognized either by me or by the staff there. And he was on the telemetry floor. A very busy nurse was taking care of him, and I was completely wiped out. And she could tell that, and Gabriel was wiped out too. And so she did what seemed to be a really sensible thing. To me, seemed very sensible. I thanked her for it. She turned the alarms off um, at his bedside, and we gratefully went to sleep. But what we didn't know is that Gabriel was in very, very serious shape despite being his normal cheerful self. Um, and his brain herniated. And instead of having those alarms going off, the nurse had inadvertently, unknowingly turned them off everywhere, not just the sound next to his bed, but also on her pager and at the nurse's station. So all of the things that could have been warning about this, the warning system failed her, and it failed Gabriel, and it failed me. Um, so he did die that night. Um, which of course changes has changed my life in every possible way. Um, Eventually I went to work at Stanford, where I worked within their risk management and claims department and help them create and nurture a program to communicate with patients and families after things went poorly. So I did that work for 12 years. It was my job to communicate with the patients and families and the risk and claims team. And so I learned a lot doing that work. It was an absolute privilege to sit with people who are remarkably vulnerable and afraid, and really appreciative of any kind of guidance they could get. And I'm not saying that this was easy work, but it was very, very impactful work, on the patients, their families, the the health system, the physicians, on me, everyone. And about a year ago, I left Stanford, and now I am creating a curriculum to take what I learned at Stanford and share it with people, to make these conversations less intimidating. I think people are really afraid to have these conversations, understandably, but I did it for 12 years and I learned a lot, and I want to take what I learned and empower more people to move forward with this important work. So that's where I'm at now.
It's brilliant. I thank you so much for the work that you've done and work that you're doing. When you say empower people to do this work, what kind of people are you talking about?
The emphasis on explaining what happened to patients and families has been really focused on training physicians how to have these conversations, which is appropriate and important. But what I think happens is for patients and families, there can be a lot of ongoing questions and concerns that maybe they don't immediately think about. And so I don't think that care systems need to hire a whole slew of people like me, but they can train existing staff. So the way I think about it is let's lean into everybody's superpowers, right? So claims and risk managers, their superpowers may not be talking to patients and families in an ongoing way. Same thing for physicians. We need them to be doing other things. So, kind of my vision is to give some knowledge and establish communication patterns between, say, social workers, care coordinators, maybe patient experience experts, to train them to understand the review process, the components of liability, the components of damages, so that they can have these really critically important conversations with patients and families so that harmed patients and families, or people who have the perception that they're harmed, very important group of people, don't feel that they need to resort to litigation to get answers. If I can do nothing in this work, I want people to understand what happened to them, and that I want to establish that way, for them to get these answers. That's my the ramblings in my brain these days.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant because I may have told you this the last time we spoke, but I've talked to several plaintiff medical malpractice attorneys, and that will be the thing that opens the conversations. I just want to find out what happened. I just want to find out what happened. I'm mad as hell that nobody will talk to me. So let's turn it over to you for a sec, RaDonda. Tell us a little bit about your in a briefest version. I know you both have tremendous stories to tell, and I hate to ask you to even keep it short, but tell us about your journey into patient safety and advocacy.
Well, like you said, they can listen to the podcast
They should.
and then they will know. They should. You should absolutely listen to both episodes. I was a young baby nurse 3 years into my career when in 2017 I made a medication error that ended the life of a patient. Um, Long story short, I was terminated, reported to the Board of Nursing, investigated, cleared, investigated again. My license was revoked, and I was found guilty of 2 felony charges as a result of this. A lot of the things that happen in between become knowledge that I obtained basically being in a situation where I was forced to have to defend myself. It was either, admit defeat in the administrative law system and in the criminal law system, or engage with them and try to move through the process, which is what I chose to do. And I learned a lot along the way about um, how I come to make the mistake that I did, about the contributing factors that led me to make decisions that I made along the way, and then about how we work in healthcare as a group of people within a system that rely on human communication along with electronic communication, and things that support us in our overarching goal of taking care of patients. And since then, I've been given plenty of opportunities to talk about what I've learned and to share them. And I hope that, like Leilani said, um, we can't turn a blind eye to these things. We have to be willing to have these difficult conversations. And she talks about having difficult conversations with those people that were affected. That is important. We need to be able to do that. And we also need to be able to understand exactly how these things happened, by engaging in those conversations with our providers and the healthcare people that were working, so that we really know not only how to have those conversations, but m- I think more importantly, how to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Well, both of you have been so open with your stories, and I want to thank you for that. As a, I think I've said some version of this to both of you, but Leilani, in your case, I've been the nurse who's turned off the alarm thousands of times. And RaDonda, in your case, I've made many medication errors in my life. I have. This is as real and true to any nurse I've ever met, as it could be. You couldn't get any closer to us. We've all done what you either had happen to you or did yourself. So, but what's so amazing, and I don't want to say refreshing is a bad word, but I've so appreciated your openness and your honesty in the public, and helping us all have conversations about these fairly difficult, helping us all have these really difficult conversations. So let's stick with you for a sec, RaDonda. What do you see as the current biggest challenge to patient safety? It's a big question, but I'm pretty sure you've got an answer.
I think there are a lot of challenges to patient safety. I think healthcare itself is up against a lot. It's changing, it's evolving. We've came through the pandemic. We are seeing our staffing change in terms of just the number of people available to do the jobs, and our patients are coming in more sick than they were pre-pandemic. Lots of young nurses whose education was impacted throughout the pandemic. Healthcare has a lot of problems. The one piece of advice that I can always give people, no matter what your job is, if you're a pharmacist, a physician, working in radiology or as a nurse, slow down and listen to your gut. If there are tasks that are not pertinent, if there are tasks that are above and beyond what you have the capacity to do, don't do them. If there are situations where you don't feel comfortable and you don't feel safe taking this assignment, taking an extra patient, don't do it. You can always ask yourself, what's the worst that's going to happen? If I do this or if I don't do this, is someone going to die? And then work backwards from there.
Yeah, exactly. Good question. That kind of takes it right down to a really pretty simple yes or no, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's hard. It's really difficult to keep your focus. Chris, working in healthcare, and Leilani, I'm sure you've seen in all of the different, incidents that you've had to work through. There are just an unfathomable number of distractions, things that are happening constantly. I mean, and it's really hard to maintain clear focus on multiple things at one time. We have to do it as part of our jobs, but continually adding more can be detrimental to an extent. And so we have to take that on our own to say, I'm not comfortable doing anything more than this. My focus is on these things or these patients. And um, I'm not willing to give more of my time or myself to other things if it's going to take away from the most important job, which is to keep people safe.
Well said, and great advice for healthcare providers. Leilani, how would you answer that question? What do you see as the current biggest challenges to patient safety?
I think it's all a giant mess for all the reasons that anybody who works in there. Um, poor, poor regulatory standards, fragmented care, overworked staffing. So I guess I think that list is long, and other people would be able to answer it more clearly than I can. But what I'm hopeful is I'm hoping AI can help us. I know there's downsides of that, but I'm hoping there's opportunities there. But I also think one big problem is that we don't train human beings to be good patients. Like I feel like healthcare in America is kind of a big lie where there's so much emphasis on it being so fantastic and really not a lot of honesty about this. So, you know, in my town, there's all kinds of billboards for the local hospitals, of course, but there's not a billboard saying, okay, this is what the CMS star rating means. This is what Leapfrog hospital rankings mean. And we do not empower people to be advocates for themselves, to collaborate with their care providers. And I think it is a huge, giant missed opportunity. Like the biggest untapped resource in healthcare are patients and families. And I I'm not saying that I know how to do this, but this is a group that wants to do better. And I really believe that clinicians want would like to be able to do better too. Like nobody wants to be living in this circumstance that we have created right now, and something has got to give. But I just think if we could empower patients and families more, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about with AI. I've been thinking of how Gabriel's story could have been different if current AI capabilities could have been layered over top of of me being completely uneducated about the healthcare system and how his symptoms could have been considered and all of that. Um, I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And so I'm I think I'm clear-eyed about the mess and hopeful about it changing.
Great answer. That is a good way of putting it. See it, but let's see a way through it. That's always, because that's always important. There's no laying down and dying here, right? You literally have to keep going. It's hard work and you have to keep at it. Two things I want to say about that, like I live in Canada, as everybody knows, but I've spent 6 or 7 months of the last 4 years in the US and experienced the healthcare system a few times. And it was striking to me how it's over promising and under delivering in quite a few situations. The billboards and the ads and the zero wait times and the board certified doctors. And then the reality of that visit was like, this guy doesn't really know what he's talking about, and he's strapped by insurance laws and rules that he can't even do what I'm asking. So that's been kind of striking to me. And I know I don't want to slam anybody's healthcare system, because those of us who work in it know that great things happen every day, every single day. But I think those of us who work in it also know that there's problems that need to be fixed. But the second thing is what you just said, Leilani, leads me perfectly into segues into the next question, because it's interesting. In every podcast, I ask our guests, who are lawyers and doctors and nurses, about the single most important thing they think the public needs to know about malpractice. And similar to what you just said, the pretty consistent advice is about maintaining a strong, great working relationship with your provider, advocating for yourself or having a trusted person advocate on your behalf, staying informed, not settling for no for an answer ever when it comes to something that you believe is necessary for your own health. This is all incredibly invaluable advice. But I'm also looking at you two, incredibly articulated, well-informed people who know how a decent relationship with with the people that you're working with, and some degree of medical literacy. But still, and I being who I am and doing what I have done, have had some serious medical errors happen in my family. My mom, I could show you, I can't even tell you some stuff that happened to my mom and my sister. And I was there even, I was there from 10 in the morning till 10 at night until they kicked me out. I was there, and still there were falls and serious medication errors and all kinds of things that went on. So even I mean, if we can't do it, that's the thing. Like, if we can't do it, like, how can patients and their families actively contribute to their own safety within the system? Comments on that from either one of you. But Leilani, you kind of ended on this point, and I loved it. So why don't you start us off on that?
I was hoping RaDonda was going to pipe in with the perfect answer to that question. Uh, uh, I mean, I see it as there's so for if we go back to my example, I had never the only experience with the healthcare system I've had in my life since then was when I gave birth to Gabriel and his sister. So I had no, like, I don't have a chronic disease. I had no capacity or need for an ongoing relationship except for their pediatrician. So I just did not have any baseline that could have amplified these little voices in the back of my head that said, something is not right here. Something is not right. Speak up, speak up. And I had no context for that. Um, and that's something that I would like to figure out how to help people with, is not put everybody through med school or nursing school, but just, okay, you're walking to the ED and here's some things you might want to think about in an app. Even having a healthcare setting encouraging people to ask these questions, which that's something I don't see, is to help advocate for yourself. And maybe it's the healthcare insurers who start advocating for their clients, who are us, help us be better advocates for ourselves. Like, we can't, to think that we can just walk in and suddenly understand the complexities of these systems to help keep us safe is not realistic. But we do have technology.
It takes years for healthcare providers to do that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it takes years for healthcare providers to do exactly what you're talking about, let alone to expect someone who has absolutely no experience with inpatient settings, to be able to advocate for themselves. It's That's a challenge, Chris, that I don't know how we fix.
And what do you have to say, RaDonda, to Leilani's comment about healthcare providers asking more questions? Because I certainly hear a lot of when a patient comes in, maybe they've even printed off information from the internet, and there'll be these,
I love it.
oh, good. Because not everybody does. I've heard a lot of smart ass comments about Dr. Google, and people do not appreciate it. So go ahead, RaDonda. What do you say?
People are gonna look for information where it's easy to find. And if Google is out there and that's what they find, that's what they're gonna find. So you can start by showing them towards a list of more reputable sources online, NIH or something like that. But again, it has to be something they could understand. I like when my patients had questions. I didn't care. I had one patient who fired me. Actually, it was his wife. And I think it was because I had a student and she was just really uncomfortable. So I excused myself and my student. But when patients were, I'm using air quotes, difficult, it was because they didn't understand what was happening. You know, and I would be more than willing to take my time to sit in their room and let them answer or let them ask as many questions as they had. And I would be frank with them. I may not know the answer to this, but what I will do is I will make a note in our chart that we had a conversation about these things so that the physicians, the care team, everyone else can see it. And then I'm going to maybe make a note on your board, and I'm going to get you a pen and a piece of paper, and I'm going to give you the ability to make that note yourself and say, let's ask someone next time they come in the room. If we get someone on the phone, we'll ask them then. But it's just a lack of information. When you are in some place that is foreign and scared, imagine if you were in a foreign prison. I equivalent that to people being in the hospital. We're speaking a language that they don't understand. We're walking around, you're getting lost in this facility that you can't navigate. It's cold, you know, you're scared, you're terrified, you don't know what's happening. It's almost a recipe for disaster in some cases. And so I believe that it makes people it empowers them if they have that baseline to know that there's someone that's willing to just listen to them and try to answer their questions. Um, you know, and that makes them a little more comfortable to be able to say, "Hey, I don't really know what this machine is or what it's doing. Let me tell you about that." And sometimes I think just taking that on before people even have to ask really helps you. And that goes back to we can't overburden the people that are working in healthcare with too many tasks. I need, as a critical care nurse, the ability to take care of no more than 2 patients because I need to be able to not only monitor them and do the things I need to do, but also have conversations with their family and loved ones that are in the room to say, "Hey, all of these things are here. If you need to move around something, this can move, this can't. If this beeps and no one runs in the room, let me know. This button is a code blue. This button calls the nurse." You know, just to kind of educate them and let them know and also encourage them, "Hey, it's okay to walk away and leave. Why don't you have a rotating shift of people?" You know, we can make a list of things so you'll know when we're going to be in and out throughout the day. So you can kind of anticipate these are going to be the busier times. These are going to be the times when the doctor's going to be around. And that just makes them a little more familiar. Just even sometimes being present for those conversations. They may not have questions, but hearing it and becoming more familiar with what they're being told and what's happening to their loved ones gives them just a little bit of knowledge to build on, during the time of their stay. And again, I speak mostly from having worked in a neurocritical care ICU where our patients stayed for a very long time and often they were not neurologically intact and we relied, on family members to have these conversations as we didn't often get to have these conversations with our patients. And um that was the one thing that we could do was just to communicate with them and try to explain to them, "This is what's happening and this is why." And, being in the facility that I worked at, say what I will about Vanderbilt and how they handled things after my situation, but while I was working there, I felt like I had all of the resources and the time to be able to do that with my patients. Even if there were younger children, we could call people over from the children's hospital to help as a resource with them. Um, we had great case managers. We had all kinds of people from many different professions that were available as resources to our families. And so it was great to be able to give that to them so that they could be a better part, a bigger part of the care picture. I don't think all hospital systems are set up to do that. And so that's a challenge. How do we how do we get that in front of our patients and have them have the ability to do that rather than right now we're kind of setting them up for failure. We whisk them in through an emergency department. God only knows what that was like. You waited a day to get into a bed and then you show up and now your nurse has 3 more patients than they ought to. You haven't seen the doctor. You probably won't for another 24 hours. You're frustrated, you're tired, you're angry, you're hungry. There's really not a lot of coming back from that.
Yeah, it's tough. So, in that reality, I guess if we could go back to the question, in that reality that you just described there, this is how it's going to go. You're in the ED, you're in a hallway bed for 3 days, and then you're administrative unit where someone's overbusy and overworked. How do patients and families actively contribute to their own safety? What do they do in that situation? Because I would love to have a nurse like you every day of my life.
I tell people, find that person that's in healthcare. You have to know someone. You know someone who's a nurse, you know someone who's knows someone who's a nurse. Get them in here, have a rotating shift of people, have a core rotating group of people, and whether or not you feel like you are being communicated with by the hospital staff, you communicate with each other. Create a logbook, create a notebook, like, ask for these things. When the nurse comes in the room, when should I expect you back? What's happening? Right? At some point, if you get 5 minutes, I just have a list of questions. Because it is helpful for those healthcare workers. They want to be able to do those things. So if you can cluster the questions that they have, "Hey, I have some questions. Here they are on a piece of paper. Can we maybe look at some time where I could get some answers to these?" But I think it's important to have someone there. I would tell someone, if you're going to the hospital, have someone with you 24/7.
That's good advice. If you can make it happen, it's really good. Leilani has something to add here.
Yeah, so I just thinking about the phantom Dr. Google and how critical people can be of that sometimes. I think it's really important to think about access. So I heard, and I can't tell you where I heard this, and I could be making it up a little bit. Um, but I think the average wait time for a kid in America to see an autism specialist is something like 6 months to have a child diagnosed with autism. And so, is it any surprise that people are doing their own research to solve these problems and to understand? Like, of course, we're going to do whatever we can to understand what's going on with our kids. The challenge there is, what kind of information are we getting? Are we using to help us solve this problem? But I think we'd all love access to a super qualified specialist whenever we need it. But that is I don't think that's true for anybody in America. Maybe Jeff Bezos or Mark Cuban can get that, but I don't think I don't think anybody else has that. And so people are always going to try to solve their own problems the best way that they can, particularly about their health or the health of a loved one. And so we can, poo-poo the Dr. Google thing, but to do that, we have to understand why that is a resource for so many people.
Even if it takes a day to get in, if you've got something going on that you're really worried about, of course, you're going to start looking it up. What's going on? I think another element of this, since we're kind of talking about what patients can do, because I act as an advocate for lots and lots of people. I have a huge family. I'm, healthcare decision maker for many, many people in both sides of my married family and my personal family. And there's a little bit of an art to advocating, isn't there? Because you can go in there just guns a-blazing and belligerent, and if you're lucky, you'll find someone like you, RaDonda, who said, I know you're upset and I know you're scared. Let's talk. But if you're not lucky, you'll get someone who will tell you to shut up, be quiet, don't be abusive, don't be rude, don't and leave the room. Like some people will understand that it's a situational upset, and some people will not understand. They just say you're being rude. So I think there's a bit of a art, and I hate to even say that, but it's true that you are able to articulate your questions and even argue with the care plan that's being proffered to you if you disagree with it, with an element of grace and knowledge that keeps you coordinated with the care team and not separated from them. Any comments on that?
It's highly emotional. I mean, how could it not be? It's a delicate conversation to have, and I'm not saying that they were easy to have, but I was just willing to have them. The same way I'm willing to have this conversation with you and with anyone else that wants to listen. If you wanna take a seat at a really crappy table and eat some really crappy food, I'll sit here with you and do that. Um, and that was my my perspective was, "Listen, I know you're upset. I get to go home at the end of 12 days or 12 hours. I get to walk out of here and get in my car and drive home and go to sleep in my bed, and you don't, and that sucks. That sucks. I see you where you are. No, I'm not where you are, but I see you where you are, and I just want you to know that." I think that's an easy way for healthcare providers to lean into that conversation. I know what you're dealing with right now is horrible. This is probably the worst experience of your life. You're terrified, you're scared. Just know that I see that and I recognize that, and I'm here as much as I can be to be a resource for you and to be an advocate for you. But, not everyone is the same. Again, and like I said, I worked in a unit where I wasn't going to be overburdened with more than two patients. So it's very easy for me to say I had a real cush unicorn situation of a job that does not represent, I think, where most people are in healthcare today. Um, I think having people with experience, having people with any kind of healthcare background helps. It helps to diffuse the situation in terms of I can explain a little bit to you. Um, And I can also maybe just sit with you for a couple of days, a time or 2 when someone is in the room, even if they can be on the phone and just listening in the background. That's always a good thing. Listen in the background and say, "Okay, when the person walks out of the room, what did they just say to me?" You know, it's unfortunate that this is the way we have to, but we have to use all the resources that you can in healthcare. When the system isn't functioning, you have to use every resource you can. If it's Google, it's Google.
How about you, Leilani? Any further comments on that from the other side, from a different perspective?
Well, I think it's I mean, workplace violence in healthcare is real. I think for whatever reasons, people always are not behaving maybe at their best for all the reasons that RaDonda noted. But for me, it's not really unusual for me to get emails or calls from people who have had bad experiences in the hospital and ask, "Okay, what should I do?" And I the first thing I say is assume positive intent. And that is to recognize no one is trying to do a bad job here. And it doesn't mean that they aren't. They might. I mean, we've all heard stories of people being bad at their job. That's certainly real, but try not to lead with that. Um, to try to recognize, I think this is always a good policy is to look at the environment and what are the motivators and what is the reality of the person trying to take care of you. Um, I don't know. I think you're always going to get further with kindness, but sometimes we all get maxed out on that.
Of course we do. Yeah. Well, anyway, I feel like we could probably talk about this for a day, but let's move on to the next question because we have a lot of ground to cover today. Ideally, the culture of patient safety in any system includes an emphasis on reporting and learning from errors, um, a commitment to continuous learning on all levels, active engagement by patients and their families. But as we have already discussed and will continue to discuss, I'm sure the real world is very, very different. If you were to try to put your finger on a specific cultural shift or shifts that need to happen to embed a culture of safety into our healthcare systems, what would you say to that? Leilani's thinking hard. Why don't you answer, RaDonda? Do you have an answer to that? I'll give you a second to think there.
Well, I think that going back to the first topic that you mentioned, which was error reporting, I can speak to that because I know I have heard from people, hundreds, thousands of nurses, that given the way that I reported my error and the fact that um, the situation was handled the way that it was, and then that internal report, which was private, was made public as part of a court document, that made people very uncomfortable because what we've been told in healthcare is that you bring us the problem so that we can find a solution. As nurses, as doctors, anyone working in healthcare with direct patient care, we want to know everything. I need to know everything about your poop. I think we've used this analogy before. It's a great one. I want to know everything. How does it smell? How does it look? How much was it? Does it float? Solid, liquid, in between? We need everything. And the higher level of care, the more questions we have to ask. So as we're looking around and we're reporting errors, I think that my case strikes fear in the heart of people when they have to think about, do I report this or do I not? My answer is always going to be to report it. Please don't ever not report it. Please don't ever not report it. And the other thing is, let's take a step beyond that. Again, when we have this perfectly operating healthcare system, we have free time, we can spot things and have conversations about how to fix them. But even taking the time to talk about and report those near miss opportunities. Those are opportunities. Those are opportunities that we are chasing to fix things before they go terribly wrong. And that is a culture. That is a culture, um, a big culture thing. Like, if we can't have the top down supporting you and asking you, what are we chasing? What are we doing? And and engage with your staff about what our current roles are, what are our current problems, and have your staff be able to have that lateral relationship, top to bottom and everywhere in between, about our goal is chasing the next problem. Like, we want to see the problem before it gets there. We don't want to just hear about the problems. When you look at a culture of safety and then you go back and you look at what are your numbers like? Are you seeing more problems reported versus near misses? If you're seeing more problems reported than near misses, that's a problem. You should be seeing way more near misses reported than actual problems, right?
Smart.
And that's the opportunity that you need to be chasing. So your staff, the culture of the people who are engaged in this culture, they need to see it from the top down. It has to start from leadership. It has to be everyone has to be on board, because if your leadership and your middle management are not on board, you can't expect the people who are going to find the problems and deliver them to you in a nice report on a gold platter to solve to do that. They're not going to do it. So the culture needs to be honesty, transparency, and we want to know if there is a problem and show them. And it starts with the top, showing people who are going to be giving this information to them that we are committed to taking what you say honestly, truthfully, seriously, and we are committed to engaging in a conversation to solve a problem, not just, we don't really care about that, or that's not really a big deal. Because when you start to disengage with them and their concerns, they will no longer report to you.
That's a great answer. And you brought up some really good points. I've never forgotten a conversation we had almost exactly a year ago today. And you talked about comparing patient safety or handling patient safety in the way that airlines do, in the sense that when you get on a plane, nobody says this is going to go fine. They say, listen, for everybody from the captain to the child in the seat knows that these things, you could have to, you could lose your cabin pressure unexpectedly or have to land in water or crash. And everybody knows what to do with an oxygen mask and that crappy little flotation device and the whistle, or the
Yeah.
whistle. Everybody knows that. Like they say, yeah, they say up top, listen, if these things happen, and I've never forgotten that level of communication and that top to bottom communication where everybody gets, kind of like you said, Leilani, things do go wrong and they might go wrong. What are we going to do if they do? So I love how that kind of all ties together. But over to you, Leilani, for a sec. I'd love to hear your answer to that question. Ideally, there's this, but realistically, there's that. What are the key cultural shifts that need to happen to embed a culture of safety in our systems?
Well, I think we need to look at it from a holistic view. And right now, I think it's very scattered. So I have the privilege of working with Patients for Patient Safety US, and I'm specifically involved in their transparency efforts. And one thing that we did, group of volunteers, highly motivated. Okay, let's figure out what each state requires for reporting. Let's put it in the Google Doc. So I, being very bright and shiny, put all the states down in alphabetical order, and everyone's supposed to post in there what every state it requires. The lack of uniformity is staggering, like absolutely staggering. Of I think Arizona requires nothing to be reported, and Minnesota requires everything, and then there's everything in review in between. And so we need to recognize who's regulating this, who's investigating it, how are they trained, how are they paid. It's not unusual. Oh, the Joint Commission showed up today, everything's changed, the hospital grinds to a halt. And what do we know about those investigators? What are their priorities? um I think everybody in healthcare has a horror story about an investigator that was difficult, unqualified, questionably motivated. You fill in all the bad attributes. And then I think it's also really important to remember there's no place for patients and families to report a problem. and to ever know what happens. So we can report concerns to our state Department of Health. Where does that go? Anywhere? We have no way of knowing. So the lack of the loops being closed in a way that brings about potentially real learning and real improvements, I just don't think it's there. And, thank goodness there's people whose whole careers are focused on patient safety. Thank goodness for them.
I think you're exactly right. I'll tell you, just a quick caveat on that. When you said there's no connecting the loop and there's no real, you're right. When I was terminated from Vanderbilt for failure to follow their policies for medication administration, I was told that I was never hireable again. I was also told that I would be contacted by the Board of Nursing, but that would be months from now. And that in between now and then, I was free to continue working as a nurse. So basically, go be someone else's problem until the board contacts you.
I think what you just said, Leilani, too, kind of ties back, RaDonda, your comment that reporting of near misses is a measure of moving forward or some success in patient safety initiatives, but the lack of reporting and the inconsistency in reporting of near misses serves no one.
There's talk about, how do you measure around communication resolution programs, which is my area of focus. And it's challenging, but to my mind, the most critical measure, and this is what I kept track of at Stanford, was the time between the event and when we found out about it. And the reason that I felt that was so important was because it was kind of a barometer of how people are feeling in your hospital. Do they know how to report? Do they know what to report? Do they feel safe? Do they have the phone number? All of those kind of things. Um, and sometimes, of course, there's going to be times if it's an RFO, of course, it's going to be a while before that's discovered. But that was a real measure of how on board people were with recognizing that things are not always perfect.
What's an RFO?
Oh, retained foreign object, I'm sorry. So, like a sponge is left in like a UFO, only different. Possibly unidentified, found, not flying. So for example, someone has a surgery, abdominal surgery, and a little tiny sponge is left in, and it's not found until multiple months later.
Canada happens to be the leader in those types of instances. If you can imagine, not a proud moment to say that, but it's true. A couple things you guys both said, which I just will never forget, is I loved your advice, Leilani, to assume the positive. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that. I think assume positive intent is really good. And your comment, RaDonda, about, I don't know exactly how you said, but let's sit down at this table and have a hard conversation with hard people and eat a bad meal. that is so true. And I think the courage to do that is sometimes what's lacking, because it takes a ton of courage and vulnerability, doesn't it, to sit down and have those types of conversations. And Leilani, you would know that better than anybody, because that's been the work you've been doing for many, many years.
Yes, and I like the table metaphor. And one thing I realized is in our reviews, we can understand what happened. We can explain it as well as we can. So I can invite you to dinner. I can make you dinner, but I can't make you eat it if you don't want to eat it. And I agree that those conversations can be really very difficult, but you'll have a hard time convincing me that it's not harder for the patient and family. Um, and that those conversations are really about caring for people, and that is ongoing care that you are providing to people. And I think a lot about the consequences of when people don't understand what happened to them. And in my own brain, I call this dismissal syndrome, where people are never have the opportunity to understand what happened to them, and they can move through the world quite high functioning, but they're never really going to thrive. And the consequence of having something happen to you or a loved one and not having the opportunity to have all your questions answered is really, I think it's like a low grade fever where you're never really going to feel all that good. And I think about it in terms of um, what we used to call shell shock, or before we were alive, but people would come back from World War I, World War II, and they all have shell shock. Well, now we know that's PTSD. It is a very real thing. It can be treated, it can be prevented, and I think there is a level of PTSD that happens to patients who are harmed, and I think to the clinicians who are involved in those events, where they just carry it around for their whole lives. And you will never convince me that there are not consequences to that. And I don't need to convince either of you of that, but it's very difficult to have those conversations and profoundly important to do it.
I just want to comment on your comment that caregivers carry that too. I taught lots and lots of legal issues and nursing conferences, and there's a lot of presentation of medical malpractice cases. And there's never been a single conference out of hundreds where some nurse came up to me at the end of it. And 25 years ago, even, something happened. There was a loss, there was a death, there was an injury. And it was never talked about. You went home, you slept, you had a shower, changed your clothes, came back to work the next day, and it was on to the next thing. But they carried the weight of that, and it was tears streaming down their faces. They told me their story. It stays in there for everybody. And, patient-wise, we all know that. We've all experienced that. Well, listen, we've been talking for almost an hour. I'd like to get to one more question, but then could you both stick around for a part 2 of this? Absolutely. Okay, so let's have one more question. Then we'll take a quick break and we'll come back, and there's more to talk about. My next question is about technology in healthcare. And I think there's absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind that it has brought some remarkable advancements. I mean, Leilani, you're mentioning AI. We have enhanced diagnostic accuracy. We have improved patient monitoring. We have access to care and information that we've never had before in the history of man. But it's also not without drawbacks. There's data privacy, data breaches. There's fussy, sticky machines that aren't really truly applicable, or I don't even know what the right word is, but like they don't realistically work in the setting that they're designed for. We have overdependence even on technology. We have alarm fatigue. We have systems there's inequity to access to care because not everybody has a computer and a smartphone and a system that allows them to have access to the information that some of us have. But I also note very clearly that technology played a role in both of the incidents that you two were involved in both of the, things that changed your lives. Are there any specific tools, and you can talk about that if you want to, about how technology was a part of what you've been through, or can we talk about how specific tools or innovations might hold promise in patient safety and reducing errors in the future?
I'll jump in on this one. I so I went to art school. I'm an artist by nature. And what I see in healthcare is a profound failure of imagination. Failure to imagine a better way and failure to imagine how things are going to go poorly. So in my son's case, I just had a really hard time understanding how the manufacturer of the machines could not understand the environments where they were placing him in. And I've recently had an opportunity to understand that a little bit better, but it seems like we focus on, oh, technology can do all of these things so well, and then are not prepared for it when it doesn't work. And that is that failure of imagination of what happens when the Pyxis machine does not work correctly, how do we what do we do then? And it just seems like we're all so pressed for time and to save money, and here's a gadget that's going to do all of those things, and we don't stop, slow down, and say, what do we do when it doesn't work? Or when it interfaces with a human who wants to take care of their patient and let him get some sleep, because clearly that's pretty necessary right now. Um, that that's where usability engineers could really be some heroes, right?
Absolutely. RaDonda, thoughts on that?
I mean, the weakest point in technology is always going to be humans. Humans who invent them, humans who create them, humans who test them, humans who work with them, humans who utilize them. Like the human factor is going to be the weakness in technology. And so, yeah, I think Leilani's right. We need to be more curious. We need to be very curious about how these things work. Again, in order to have that, we need time. We need time and we need capacity within our workflow to be able to do that. I mean, there are so many pieces of technology that you can utilize in the higher level of care, the bigger the facility you are, the more pieces of technology, the more pieces of equipment that are coming together. And it can be very useful whenever they are all working well and working properly. And it can be catastrophic when they don't. Where is that in between balance of knowing how do we continue to do our jobs without the use of technology when it doesn't work or when it isn't available? Um, I remember in my case specifically, um, during the criminal court hearing, one of the district attorneys questioned the only witness that I had about, if she could have made this same mistake. And she said, are you asking me as a nurse of 30 years, or are you asking me as a nurse, you know, like her of 2 to 3 years? Because I can tell you, growing up through my career, I would have absolutely relied on my eyeballs and the old way, this internal technology of doing things. But because that's the way that I spent the majority of my career, and that is embedded in me. But this newer generation of nurses are taught all the way through nursing school, barcode scanning, you check the MAR, you check everything is done, and it is enforced within you to utilize the technology. If you are not utilizing the technology, you're not doing it correctly, if you're not communicating with it. So I can't tell you that, if I had been this nurse with this much experience, would I have done the same thing? No, it would have been different. And I think that's a big challenge too, is figuring out it's great. The technology is wonderful. I was so excited when they were launching Epic because I was now going to be able to communicate between all of my patients' information. I could see them if they were coming into the emergency department. I could actually see what the nurses were writing, what their vital signs look like, what their history looked like, what medicines they'd been given, what time did they get that TPA. It's there. Whereas before, different. Also, if they're coming from the operating room, because we didn't have a PACU, we were the PACU. I could see everything that was going on with that. So that information was extremely helpful for us to be able to do a better job. But when it doesn't communicate, like in the incident of me trying to pull the particular med I was looking for, again, catastrophic. Um, it's Humans are always going to be the weak point. And so we do need to be curious. We do need to be inquisitive. We need to be remembering what these processors are like without the aid of the technology, because it isn't always going to be there for us. We have to remember that, it can fail just like we can. If a power outage occurs, we need to do something different, right? And so uh, healthcare has to keep happening. It's not like other industries where we can take a break or shut our doors. And that leaves us exceptionally vulnerable for bad things to happen if we are not prepared for how we can operate both with technology and without it.
That is such a good point, because I think that's not happening. It's not happening that we're like, listen, it's like kind of what you're talking about, everybody knowing what the backup plan is if there's a problem. Like here, let's just take a simple piece of machine like a blood pressure pump and say, but listen, if this blood pressure pump stops working, or the power goes out, or the cord gets broken, or whatever happens, this is where we're going to keep the cuff and the stethoscope. And you need to be all keen on your skills of how to take a blood pressure and check a pulse manually. And yeah, you have to, but that's maybe where we're getting lost. And it's, again, goes back to what both of you have said in some version. Let's just assume things are going to go wrong and plan for that scenario.
Yeah, I think about often you'll hear healthcare, the metaphor of aviation, right? Like, oh, well, planes crash and we investigate and all that, which I'm all for. But when the plane or the door flew off of the Alaska Airlines flight, okay, what happened? We ground all the planes and we investigate. And that is not a luxury that happens, right? Like the the healthcare system that was hacked and everything went down, it's not like they could divert some of their patients and they did, but it's not like you can just say, okay, we're canceling all care today and we'll rebook you when we can. Like it's a false equivalent to say that it's the same. It's just far, far more complicated.
Far more complicated. And it's very difficult for those people who are in administrative positions to say that we're going to turn away patients and divert patients and, cancel all of our surgeries, and send all of our patients out. Is it the right thing to do? Yeah. Is it gonna happen? The answer is just no, it's not. It's not. I mean, I remember hearing from people who are working in healthcare here in Nashville and all over the country whenever it was in May to June, whenever we were having so many issues with all of these electronic health records that just weren't working. People were overriding medications constantly. There was no information to be had. And what I would see is two very different pictures. Nurses who had been around when the time of paper charting existed, when you had an entire paper chart, you had the H&P, you had orders, you had everything. It was in a paper chart. And they would say, "Oh, I just missed the days of paper charting." Well, you didn't just lose your paper chart, baby girl, and the ability to document your assessment. What you lost was every bit of information about this patient, all of their history, all of the orders, everything. The ability to give information from one department to another when we have lab results. Everything is gone. It's not just your ability to document, it's the ability for the entire system to continue to run without the help of that piece of technology.
So the specific question was, is there anything hopeful? And I didn't
Did we answer it well, or did we just say no?
I didn't hear anything particularly hopeful from either of you.
People are hopeful.
Yeah, except what I would say is the people are hopeful. I agree, the people are hopeful. And there is a lot of good with technology. We know that. I know that. I believe in it. But I think what I did hear both of you say is that we've just got to be realistic with it and understand there are going to be problems, and we've got to have backup for the problems, not if they occur, but when they occur, because they're going to happen. So not particularly hopeful, but very, very practical. So thank you so much both for that. Well, listen, let's call this the end of episode 1. And I just want to say, I knew this would be great and I knew it would be easy, but I'm just sitting here. My heart is singing at how open and honest and brilliant you both are. So thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll come back and finish this conversation in part 2. I want to say thank you to everyone out there for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe and leave us a good review. And don't forget that in many jurisdictions in both Canada and the US, doctors, attorneys, and nurses can claim continuing ed for listening. The podcast is available on all the usual platforms and on the Inside Medical Malpractice YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in over the next few episodes as we further break down this issue of patient safety. And what we're going to get to in the next episode is how patient safety initiatives may be able to affect malpractice outcomes. And we're going to talk to guests like these two who know this subject inside out. So goodbye and take care, and thanks for tuning in.